And we are live. Just wanted to check whether I can hear myself. Yes. All right, because one time I did a whole live stream with my mic muted. So I never want to make that mistake ever again. But yeah, I don't want to make that mistake again. And so let's get into this straight away. What got me into this was when I had a chat with a Messianic Jew. Well, was a Christian, yeah, and he said he doesn't like predestination, and he said, "Hey, Paul was taught by the Rabbi Gamaliel, and I think Paul mentions it in his epistle to the Galatians, I think, or Romans, and he says." Yeah, he was taught in a school or to his Rabbi Gamaliel, and he said, well, in that school, this Jewish Messianic Jew, his surname's Gaza. I met him. I kind of had a chat with him, kind of mini debate on James White's. It's not James White's, but dividing line highlights on predestination, and then latent flowers was the topic there. And he said, "Hey, Paul didn't teach predestination because the Jewish heritage doesn't teach it." And he was, of course, a Jew before when God saved him. And he said, what Paul taught was not God's sovereign choice, it was free will. And I'm thinking, that got me thinking. And I looked into it. And so I typed in Paul, predestination, Second Temple Judaism. I actually typed in Paul, predestination, Judaism, and things came up. So I looked into it, I did a bit of reading, and there's some things on it. Okay, so, and we'll get into just this is the books that you may want to read and look at buying. I'll just get into it a little bit, and I'll read the article. Can I zoom in? There we go. Now, no, I don't want to. Okay, here we are. Look, you see, this is one of the quotes that the article that I'll be reading from by Robert Weisner, and I asked for his permission to do it. Hopefully he will not be watching. It's huge pressure to read through someone's article, and he'll be listening. But here's something from Chad Thornhill, that the Chosen People, Election, Paul, and Second Temple Judaism, as you can see here. So that Paul's view of grace was influenced by a certain group of Jewish teachers, and they believed in predestination and things like that. And so Thornhill goes through that in this book. And so if you want to look into this more, I encourage you to buy it. So the Jews considered themselves a people set apart for God's special purpose. How Second Temple understandings of election influence key Pauline texts. And so, yeah, so on view on grace, was if you emphasize grace, which Paul does in Romans 11, he mentions election there based on grace, and then Galatians, Ephesians, you type in grace. Actually, I'll probably do this now. I'll probably do it later on anyway. You type in grace, and those books will come up more that mentions grace. The more you emphasize grace, the more is based on God's sovereignty here. And you see Romans 18 times Paul mentions grace. Ephesians 13 times. And the next one is Corinthians, 2 Corinthians. So Paul does that a lot, mentions grace. And another one is, so I encourage you to get this book. Another one was by Matthew Levering, and he was a Thomist. For those who know that who that is, I'll look. Levering, and he's got a book on it as well, and he looks into the same topic. And those who don't know, Thomas, the one who follows, or not follows really, but is likes reading the theological works of Thomas Aquinas, and who was basically an Augustinian himself, as was the Reformers, and many of the Reformers quoted Aquinas, Luther, Calvin, especially the guy on my icon, whatever, not icon, but display picture, Peter Martyr Vermigli, and he was basically a Thomist. So, and he basically says the same thing here. Oh, I've got in too close. And he says predestination been the subject among many Christians, and he mentions firstly predestination doctrine is taught in New Testament reflect the importance Second Temple Judaism. Let's see if there's anything more that is, and he goes into the history of it, or in church history here, yes, and their view on it, but also who and what influenced Paul, in a sense. So there's one book there, but also there's many other books that I will not get into, but you can just look on Google, type in Paul predestination and Judaism, election, whatever you want, and here. So this is the thing we're going to be looking into. Just zoom in a little bit more so you guys can read it. Have I moved? My computer's a little laggy for those who know, but so let's get a bit of the background on it. Okay, there's 3 people watching. Welcome to you all 3. Matter of time till you leave. So yeah, here's something that where is it? So basically, Paul was influenced by, of course, we'll say God 100%, yeah, but who does God use to influence Paul? I've had many people, quite a few people say, oh, God influenced Paul. Yes, no disagreement there. But like in our lifetime, God uses people to influence us. So who influenced Paul? And so here we see, once again, the key term, the question of grace. It's all about grace, predestination, election, all of God's sovereignty. Second Temple Judaism was the topic of the 5 sources, was Wisdom of Solomon, the Qumran Hadayot, Pseudo Philo, 4th Ezra, and then he mentions the Thanksgiving hymns, which were basically, these were the Essenes, and they authored the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they copied many of the Old Testament scrolls that is in the, of course, found in the Dead Sea in the cave. And so, which contain, and in these Thanksgiving hymns, which contain some overly predestinarian language and efficacy of God's grace, as I believe Paul does. So, okay, and you'll see there are very similar terms that they used, like spiritual darkness and light, and which is interesting because you don't see that type of language in the Old Testament. We'll go through that now just a little bit before we get into it. You type in darkness and light, which is in regards to spiritual light and darkness. You look in the Old Testament, hardly anything there. Most is Job, and that's talking about creation of night and day. Isaiah and things like that, it's rarely been mentioned. But you go to the New Testament, John, I've read a work, and John was influenced somehow. You go to John, and spiritual darkness and spiritual light is mentioned a lot. Talking about, there it is, the light shines in the darkness. This has judgment light, and Jesus mentions it there. Again, Jesus spoke, I am the light of the world. And so John mentions it here many times. And you go to Romans twice, Corinthians, Ephesians, and things like, and John as well. So you see, because if there's hardly any of this mention of spiritual darkness and light, then where did Paul get it from? Did he just get on by himself? Well, it's a little bit hard to come to that conclusion, because if it's not in the Old Testament, and Paul did read the Old Testament on the apostles, I mean, they knew it off by heart, by memory. So they definitely did have some sort of influence in some sort of way. So, and that already kind of tells you right there they had that some sort of influence in this matter. So, and they read the Apocrypha, as I believe the apostles did, but they didn't view it as inspired, just as for edification. And that can be kind of said with the Epistle of Jude, when he mentions Enoch. That Jesus will come with his 10,000s of saints, and that's from Enoch. And Enoch has references to predestination and election, which is in the Ethiopian Orthodox canon, and they're the only ones who have it in their canon, which is very interesting. So, this is a study, and then the Dead Sea Scrolls, Sirach, and there. So we get into it, just a bit of the so Chadwick Thornhill, again, as I mentioned his book before, The Chosen People, Election and Second Temple Judaism. And so let's dive into it. And part 3. So I want to get rid of it so my computer can get a little laggy here. So let's get to part 3, get into it. I can actually put this in the comment section if you want to look this into yourself and read it. There it is, if anyone wants to. Okay, so part 3 here, and let's get into it. I don't know how much time I wasted for the introduction. Oh, Microsoft account problem. Yeah. Anyway, so part 3 here. See how long I'll normally be, an hour usually. Gone 12 minutes in. Okay. So let's get onto it. So he wants to begin here with some Jewish materials plotting from Paul's theology of election. I will make clear, he says, that we cannot affirm the question predestination, election, salvation. Some in theological tradition to make election is a complex topic. Election language used in several ideas, making predestination one many, not mutually. So Jewish concepts of election here. So he mentions there Carson here, and what I'm looking here is for quotes, and we'll get into it right now. So in wisdom literature like Sirach, election language can refer to possession of a divinely dispensed wisdom, like Jacob. Israel was elected because God commanded wisdom to take up residence there, and this notion has roots in first chapter of Sirach, where we are told that creation God created wisdom and determined to dispense her to general all, but in special abundance to those who love him. There is a connection made in reception of wisdom, filled with his law, a nice measure of wisdom. Yahweh gave her Torah, and then so choice quality here. As I've said, Enoch. In first Enoch, we find some examples of election language used to describe the quality of election as a choice. In chapter 93, verse 2, and that is a huge book. I've kind of read a little bit before, as we see elect of the world in synonymous parallel to the children of righteousness. It is the elect ones of righteousness whom God will choose. So this is the first term we see here. In chapter 93, in first Enoch 38, 1-4, the elect ones is used to mean those who are righteous and holy, in contrast to wicked and sinners. And Grandham summarizes that which is elect is now are quality the connotations of the term that which is ethically and religiously good, and that which is worthy of being elected. So from the crux of election 42. So the call to vocation, we also find that election carries with the obligation of special duty of manifesting God's glory to the nations. Therefore, we see some sources being chosen is about being given as a special task by God. So you may say servant in a sense. Israel, for example, is kept the law terms of covenant to display God's unique righteous character to surrounding peoples. So we see from Deuteronomy chapter 4, verse 6 to 8. Keep them and do them, will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, they will say, surely this great nation is wise and understanding people. For what great nation is that has a God so near as the Lord our God is to us, whenever we call upon him, and that great nation is there that has statutes and rules righteous as you call. Well, I mentioned there, but so we see in Sirach chapter 45, verse 4 to 5, we read that God chose Moses in order to teach Jacob the covenant and Israel his decrees. In Psalms of Solomon 14:7, David's chosenness speaks of his appointment to the office of king. Peter repeats this idea when he applies the language of Israel election to the church, saying that they have been chosen in order that you may proclaim the acts of him who you called out of darkness to marvelous light. Again, we see that sort of language used of spiritual darkness to light, because we don't see that in the Old Testament. And if someone does find something like that, please do show me, because I can be wrong. But if it is in the Old Testament, it may be mentioned once or twice. And we see in the Thanksgiving hymns or Dead Sea Scrolls that it's mentioned a few times, quite a few times, where it's a sort of emphasis in God's sovereign election that he transforms them from kingdom of darkness to kingdom of light. The concept of vocation is a biblical work regarding both election and Christology. So we're elected because of Christ, because of his work. And we see here, another interesting aspect of election shows up in the Old Testament, especially in Paul, which focus of great study. So we kind of see, look at this guy's surname and type in keywords, election, predestination, and you'll find his works and maybe even articles. Is the way God's choice of Israel or New Covenant people serves to illustrate a divine reversal of human system, and then that which has no outstanding inherent value becomes precious by divine election. That which is not choice in itself becomes an object of God's choice. So because of God's first-hand choice. And this is from the book, The Crux of Election. This is apparent in Israel's patriarchal narratives when Isaac is chosen over Ishmael and Jacob over Esau, showing God's disregard for primogeniture. Then they quite explicitly in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 6 to 7, regarding Israel's choice, we read, "You are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you to be a people for his treasured possession out of all the peoples who are on the face of the earth. It was not because you were more in number than any other people that the Lord set his love on you and chose you, for you were the fewest of people." So we don't see any reason why the Lord chose Israel to be his people. Why did God choose them? It's because the Lord set his love on you. That's basically, and we see that sort of language in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 4 to 5. In love, God predestined you. And then Robert Weisner here mentions, Paul picks up this idea in 1 Corinthians 1:26, or may as well go there. 1 Corinthians 1:26. he says, "For consider your calling, brothers. Not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth." And then when he invites his audience to recognize they were called by God, even though, according to worldly standards, they should not have been valued. This concept is illustrated most vividly in Ezekiel 16, where God describes his unconditional electing love for Israel as having compassion on a newborn child who was not even loved or properly cared for by her parents, and later whoring and adultery or idolatry he will again restore her, thus again choosing her through an everlasting covenant. There was no reason Israel should have been chosen, and every reason for God to have rejected her. According to Paul, the church is the same boat. Nevertheless, God set his covenantal affection upon his people, thus reversing normal measures of value. So, this is what we get into outside of the biblical literature here. Thornhill and others have focused much on the importance of corporal election, Old Testament and Second Temple literature, as relevant background to Paul's and the rest of the New Testament thought. When the corporate element of election is in focus, the text speak of one receiving elect status benefits by joining the elect community. Individuals are not the focus of election, but God has chosen the group so that individuals become elect by joining the community. The clearest examples in this category are found in the sectarian literature of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the Essenes, who believed in predestination, especially the community rule. Those who repent and undergo lengthy, demanding process of joining the Yahad community become God's members of New Covenant people. This community believed that the temple was defective, so that forgiveness was available for their members. Now as we see in the later post, the corporate element of election was observed here did not preclude predestination of Thornhill, as others seem to assume. In fact, divine predestination in this document, in form we have it, the crucial theological undergirding that explains why only a relatively small number of Israelites joined the community remained there. The vast majority did not. So when discussing the election in the Old Testament, it is important to make the note of remnant motive, especially prominent in the prophetic books. The theme of the features heavily in the Second Temple literature. So that is mentioned in the Second Temple literature by the looks of it. And the Gospels, Romans 9, chapters 9 to 11, is the idea of an elect people within the elect nation, a true Israel within Israel. That is, not all Israel is truly elect in the fullest and most ultimate sense, despite being in the covenant. According to Jeremiah, chapter 31 to 34, this problem will not exist in the new covenant. There is great diversity in just how this concept works in the variegated literature in the question. This notion, special when the nation is divided by those who follow Solomon. I want to get to the point here. Here in Isaiah 1 provides some important evidence of the remnant concept. Judah compromises children who have rebelled against their father. Yahweh, verse 2, this evokes God's judgment against the daughter of Zion. Verse 8, however, Yahweh has spared a few survivors, lest Judah completely eradicated like Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 9. In Isaiah chapter 10, verse 20 to 22, inclusion in the remnant is shown to be on an individual basis according to Yahweh's powerful eschatological act of deliverance. And this is what it says. In that day, the remnant of Israel and the survivors of the house of Jacob will no more lean on him who struck them, but will lean on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. In truth, a remnant will return, the remnant of Jacob, to the mighty God. For though your people Israel be as sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will return. Destruction is decreed, overflowing with righteousness. Kind of remnant ideologies contribute to the events during the Maccabean revolt, as the apocalyptic version of Daniel chapter 11 and First Maccabees, through those faithful to the covenant, participate in violence. So this seems only justifiable if those Jews who had compromised and engaged in the view as idolatry thought to be outside of sphere of election in a very real sense. The community of the Dead Sea Scrolls held similar views, but instead of using violence to eradicate the problem, restore the nation within exclusive community as the faithful remnant of the true Israel, in some ways, though, important differences as well. Jesus and the early Christian movement saw themselves as the faithful remnant of Israel, comprised literally of a small number of Jews who had heeded the eschatological call to repent, believe the gospel, along with those Gentiles who were added to the covenant. Through the union with the Messiah Jesus, the true Israel, for example, Romans 9, 6 to 29, 11, 1 to 32, and 1 Peter 2, 4 to 10, excluding those Israelites who did not believe, Romans 9:30 to 10:21. Thus, election in some contexts mean more than being part of Israel in general. Part of Israel would experience was not useless. So, all right, drinks break here. I'm talking a lot, so I'll be drinking a lot of water. I'm kind of reading through it fast. I'm going to get to the point that I want to make here. There were Jews in the Second Temple period who speculated why God has chosen Israel at all. If it was not because of some special quality in those chosen, then God seems to be capricious, in which most Jews would not accept. There will always be the question of whether Israel's election precludes her finally being rejected, or having been finally rejected for persistently violating the covenant. Romans chapter 9 to 11. Does election affect the elect's one's faithfulness, or does God choose whom He foresees will be faithful to the terms of the covenant? This all naturally leads to the questions about human violation and divine sovereignty and predestination. Some Jews, strangely in my view, believe God chose Israel because He foresaw they alone would be able to keep the covenant. Others said the patriarchs for a reason. Anyway, so that's part 3. So part 4, part 3 of this. Part 4 or part 3 here. All right, this is where we get into the meaty stuff. So you've kind of seen the biblical background of it. Hello, Stacey Jane. Nice for you to meet. 10 people listening. Wow, you guys enjoying this, or you finding this boring? Leave your honest comment in the comment section. Okay, so we'll get to the point now. Predestination and election in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, the last post we reviewed, evidence of predestination election in Sirach, focusing on chapter 33, and that's the Apocryphal book, and I have got one myself, but you can read it online if those. So in the Dead Sea Scrolls, it's got it there. I cannot say I'd like to, and it gets to it. Anyway, so let's get into it. Discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls recognized a distinctive note of determinism that was important for how the community at Qumran understood themselves. This community believed themselves to be the faithful remnant of Israel, that the rest were lost because of their hope of a corrupt cult. There was no temple cult that was no longer effective in providing atonement and covenant maintenance. So that's what is Damascus covenant. The community itself was the locus of election. Okay, so here is what it said. I'm sure you guys can read this. And for God had not chosen them from ancient eternity before they were created. He knew that what they would do. He rejected the generations of old and turned away from the land until they were gone. He knows the numbers of appearance and the number of the exact times. Everything that has ever existed will ever exist before it happens in proper time for all the years of eternity, and all of those times he has arranged that they should be for himself people called by name, so that they would always be survivors of the earth, replenishing the surface of the earth with the descendants. He taught them through those anointed by the Holy Spirit seers of truth. He explicitly called them by name, but whoever he had rejected, he caused to stray. So that seemed to be double predestination there. This covenantal text was known to us before the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, since copy was discovered in Cairo, Geniza. Therefore, strictly speaking, this document does not reflect distinctive theology of the Qumran community at Qumran in every particular. Nevertheless, they clearly valued it and considered to be of the same spirit that were continued to believe. This document played a crucial role for scholars understanding origins of the community produced the Dead Sea Scrolls. So, this passage emphatically makes the point that community alone is the true and faithful remnant of Israel. Those who do not embrace their teachings and practice of apostasy will be destroyed by God's wrath. This is explained in terms of non-election from eternity, for God had not chosen them from ancient eternity. Line 7. This translation of line 8 may be a bit misleading. The verb translated he rejected is better rendered he hated or he abhorred. The translation, so he rejected their generation, leads as though author intends to suggest that their being hated is a result of God foreknowing their evil deeds. However, this is not required by the grammar employed in the Hebrew, and I think it is somewhat out of touch. Which speaks of God's pre-temporal election. God's foreknowledge is not introduced at the grounds of election. As we see later, God's foreknowledge is sought to be creative in the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's what it means. DSS, Dead Sea Scrolls. Not his learning by peering down the corridors of history in advance. Thus, line 11, we read, God providentially ensured that he will always have a faithful people called by his name. This occurs by his special calling, also known as effectual calling, or irresistible grace in a sense, according to line 13. So this is what now we're getting into the treatise of the two spirits. So the scholars of the Second Temple Judaism believe this is the clearest systematic expression. We have the belief in an individual predestination, resulting in covenantal membership and eventual salvation. In column 3 and 4, there is a text unknown, the treatise on the two spirits. Although this passage is long, it is worth reading in full. Okay, I'll have to read this. I want to get to the point of it because I don't want to. So. Okay, we kind of see here's God's sovereignty here. He has ordered all their designs so that they may come to exist at their appointed times as he has ordained by his glorious plan. They fulfilled their destiny as a destiny is impossible to change. He controls the laws, and in all things he provides all pursuits. And so we see here all that is now and ever shall be originates with the God of knowledge before. So we see there. I don't see anything here that jumps out. He created mankind to rule over the world, appointing them to two spirits to walk a time till the time ordained for his visitation. These are the spirits, truth and falsehood, fate and originate the habitation of light, perverse with the fountain of darkness. The authority of the Prince of Light extends to the governance of all righteous people. Therefore, they walk in the paths of light. Anything jumps out? Yet the God of Israel and the angel of his truth assist all the sons of light. It is actually he who created the spirits of light and darkness, making them the cornerstone of every deed, the impulse premise of every action. God's love for one spirit lasts forever. He will be pleased with its actions for always. The counsel of the other, however, he abhors, hating its every impulse. See, this is a long read. Anything spirit of nothing. I don't see anything that jumps out. Okay. See, maybe. Hold on. The operations of the spirit of falsehood result in greed. I'll get down through here. Spirits of. Okay, there's nothing really here that jumps out. I'm going through this a little bit fast, but if you guys want to read, I'll put it in the comment section. There's like 10 parts to this, so but I recommend the readers interested in more information see Philip Alexander's essay, Predestination and Free Will, in the Theology of the Dead Sea Scrolls in Divine and Human Agency in Paul and His Cultural Involvement, edited by John M. G. Barclay and Simon J. Gaither Cole and Marcus Bocumil, Essays, Grace and Works in Destiny, Salvation in Qumran's Community Rule. So this passage expresses crucial theological beliefs of the community. Stated so to enlighten and teach all the sons of light about the character and fate of humankind, the passage served as a form of catechesis for the members of the sect of Qumran, which is required as the thesis of the text is found in chapter 3, verse 15 16. All that is now and ever shall be God of knowledge. Before things come to be, He had ordered all their designs so that when they do come to exist at their appointed times, ordained as by His glorious plan, they fulfill the destiny impossible to change. The destinies of the individuals, whether to salvation or destruction, are predetermined at creation by God's design. That which He ordains is fixed and cannot be possibly changed. The passage goes on: two spirits created by God, the spirits of truth and falsehood. Chapter 3, verse 8 and 19, the spirits of light and darkness. According to God's assignment creation, human fate is determined. The result, those who receive the spirit of truth, eternal blessings, perpetual joy through the life everlasting, crown of glory. And I want to get to the point where there's parallel text to Paul's epistles. There's, as you see, D.A. Carson is quoted here, so there's many people who have done works with this. So scholars have recognized that behind the heavy emphasis on divine determinism is community's unusually pessimistic anthropology. The community believed that sin and disobedience are unavoidable for humans, even covenant members. Therefore, apart from divine enlightenment and enablement, no one is capable of obeying God's commands and escaping His unfortunate condition. This sounds familiar. Of Augustine's view, and the opposite view was Pelagius, relying on his free will. Jason's, and then it goes through here. So he says here, the hymns are called a hadayot because the note of thanksgiving is emphatic throughout. The hymns generally open with, I give thanks, O Lord, or blessed are you, therefore the mood of thankfulness. Yes. I want to get to the quotes. Thanksgiving hymns introduced ideas of predestination, which could occupy us for a very long time. The two longest passages found in, okay, I want to get to it. In the wisdom of your knowledge, you determined their destiny before they came into existence. According to your will, everything comes to pass, and nothing happens apart from you. Again, God's knowledge is not His history in advance, since the text speaks of God's determining the destinies of the individuals before they exist. So we see again, apart from you, nothing is done. Without your will, nothing is known. So Sirach 33:13 says here that according to his good pleasure, that we saw in Sirach 33:13. So we see double predestination in chapter 7, 24-37. That the way is not in himself, nor is the person able to determine his step, but I know that in your hand is the inclination of every spirit, all his works you have determined before you created him. So we see that there. How should any be able to change your words? You alone have created the righteous one, and from the womb you established to heed your covenant, grace, to walk in all things, nourishing himself, your compassion. So he gets into there. But the wicked you created for the time of your wrath, from the womb you set them apart for the day of slaughter. For they walk in which is not profitable, and they reject your covenant, their soul abhors your truth. So you can read that later on. I'll put that in there. Comment section. I want to see more parallel. God determined to do this so that all might know your glory and great power. Importance of divine effectual calling and election is seen in chapter 15, verse 38. I give thanks to you, O Lord, for you have not cast my lot in fraudulent assembly, nor have you seen my portion in council of the pretenders, but you call me to your mercies, to your forgiveness and abundance of your compassion for all the righteous judgments. So God could have determined his fate. The result of his was found among those who will eventually experience God's judgment. God has called the hymnist into mercy, resulting forgiveness and experience of divine grace. And so let's get into part 5 of this. How is everyone? Everyone fallen asleep? Yeah, is this boring? So we see part 5. This is where he gets into predestination in Rebecca Back. You say it's not boring. I find it's good for the church to understand our history, especially we see an attack on the Bible. And this is partly why I'm doing this, because of certain group that I will not mention, the provisionists, and it gives you some sort of understanding that it's very clear that there's some sort of background to this, that Paul didn't write, you know what, I believe in predestination now. There's got to be a background to it and who influenced him. So yeah, now I want to get to the point, the absence of free will. So when you read the New Testament, there's a lot of absent free will quotations. When someone has a chat with you on free will and predestination and man is unable to seek God and so on and so forth, they barely use free will passages in the New Testament. They always go in the Old Testament, really. Choose you this day whom you will serve, Joshua 24:15 and Deuteronomy. And I don't think that is talking about free will. For those whom God has chosen, they will choose life, and those whom God has not chosen, they will choose death. Very simple. Okay, here it is. We see some sort of connection here of Paul and the sources. It is important to note the difference with some of them. I noticed the examples of explicit affirmations of free will in Sirach. So if you ever heard the expression, God has given man free will, that is found in the Apocrypha. I forgot which one. I think it's Sirach. And yeah, and that is where it comes from. And the Psalms of Solomon. So So in Romans 8:7-8, Paul says that those who are in the flesh therefore lack God's empowering spirit, are unable to obey God's law or do what pleases him. In Ephesians 2:1-10, God's people were formerly dead in trespasses and sins and are under the domain of the spirit that is now in workers under disobedience. Verse 2, this necessitates, I'm reading so fast so I can't pronounce words, and it's late in night here in Australia after midnight, so don't blame me. This, on the work of God's part, accounts a new creation, verse 10, and we see this Romans 6:3-4, 2 Corinthians 4:6, 5:17, Titus 3:4. For such cannot be affected by lifeless human beings. Scholars such as, and he talks Second Temple Judaism, have noted that Paul shares, here we go. Paul shares much of this negative anthropological language in common with the Thanksgiving hymns of the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's taken, 45 minutes to find a direct parallel. I apologize. It was this negative estimation of humanity that led the Essene community in the Dead Sea Scrolls to posit in the explicitly dual predestination without which they could explain their own existence. Okay, so Paul's strong, clear, explicit anthropological pessimism places him in the company of those Jews who explain covenantal membership and salvation in terms of individual predestination, even before we consider the passages that address the subject directly. We can confirm this by considering the most explicit mention of human will in Paul, Romans 9:15. After rehearsing God's choices in election exclusion in biblical history, Paul deduces the theological conclusion: election does not depend on human will. So he puts down the human will. So it doesn't depend on human will. There's no synergistic cooperation of man and God. And by the way, synergistic means working together, just like synchronized swimming, that you work together with another person in that act. So it's synergistic, it's working together. And of course, monogism is mono. It's alone. God alone acts in salvation, or exertion. But on the God who does mercy, my translation. Categorically, therefore, Paul is at odds with Jewish authors mentioned above, who affirm the importance of human violation in election and salvation, choosing instead to uphold divine free will as the standard. Predestined passages in Paul. So, this brings us to positive statements in Paul's letters that seem to affirm the kindness of predestination we observed in Sirach 33, the Dead Sea Scrolls, although there are other texts that discuss this. Okay, let's get into this here. For God has not destined us to wrath, but to obtain salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. 1 Thessalonians 5:9. The verse comes at the end of a letter that Paul wrote to the church, based on 2 Thessalonian letters. It seems that some in the church had some to believe in over-realized eschatology and were concerned that those who died prior to Christ's return would not be able to participate in the resurrection. Okay. There were two interesting parallels we observe here. First, in Thessalonians 5:5, Paul says that his audience, children of light, were not of the darkness. Read along verse 9, which sounds, okay, this sounds remarkably like the treatise in the two spirits here, where God is said to have signed the spirit of light, and those who are destined to experience wrath, the spirit of darkness, coupling this darkness appointment to wrath or salvation makes perfect sense. If Paul shares the perspective reflected in the treatise in the two spirits, second, we find a direct verbal parallel in the Thanksgiving hymns. The hymnist gives thanks to God because he has not cast my lot in fraudulent assembly, nor you have set my portion in the council of the pretenders. But you call me to your mercies, for your forgiveness you have brought me an abundance of your compassion. Paul begins in the letter by thanking God for his election of the people, which was evidenced by the effectiveness of the gospel ministry. We see that in chapter 1, verse 2 to 5. Moreover, the Greek Paul uses to speak of God having not appointed his audience for wrath is nearly perfect translation of the Hebrew in the hymnist, you have not set my portion. The hymn goes on to describe how this appointment results in his receiving insight and being established for for salvation through the covenant community, just as Paul knows that God has chosen the believers in Thessalonica because his preaching was received by faith. Paul's election and appointment to wrath or salvation makes good sense when read in light of the similar passage in Dead Sea Scrolls. Therefore God sends a strong delusion that they may believe what is false, in order that all may be condemned who did not believe in the truth, but has pleasure in unrighteousness. But we ought to always give thanks to God for you, brothers beloved by the Lord, because God chose you from the beginning to be saved through the sanctification of the Spirit and believe in the truth. 2 Thessalonians chapter 12, verse 11 to 13. I want to find so the language strong delusion from God that leads to their rejection of the truth, similar to the spirit of falsehood described in the two spirits. And by the way, you can buy a book on the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I remember when I was at the Plaza here in Australia, for those who are interested, I went to a shop and I found the Dead Sea Scrolls, and I started to flick through it, and I thought, well, this sounds like I'm reading Augustine's work, or Calvin. It mentions predestination, elect, and things like that. And so there was probably like close to 500 to 600 pages. So for those who are interested, you can buy a book on the Dead Sea Scrolls documents, and you can read what I'm reading here in greater detail, because this is just a small portion of how many pages that was printed, what I saw at a bookshop there. So that was really interesting. Now I can't find the book. I don't know what happened to it. Maybe someone bought it. So, I lost my way. Described this connection adds to the support when we look carefully at the Greek Paul uses in verse 13. Parallels God's agency in salvation. However, this context, we want to find the parallel here. So if so, we have Paul's. Okay, so let's go. However, in this context, where we have a contrast between those who receive a strong delusion that results in believing falsehood and those chosen for salvation, I believe that the objective reading makes better sense. If so, we have Paul using language parallel to the spirit of truth described in the treatise of the two spirits. Even without this conceptual parallel, the treatise of the two spirits, we would still have a clear affirmation of individual election to salvation. Paul presents humanity at the Lord's return in the clearly dualistic terms, both groups created as a result of God's activity. There is a textual critical issue determine whether Paul originally wrote that God chose his people as first fruits or from the beginning. The evidence at the manuscript themselves is essentially a stalemate. Most commentators, however, have pointed to parallel Pauline passages to show that Paul regularly uses pre-temporal indicators when election. We see Romans 8:29, Ephesians 9:14, which inclines them to take from the beginning as original. To the parallel here, and we see the Ephesians 1:3-14 quote, but I will not read that now. Gone 54 minutes. Everyone knows that. I'm sure everyone uses that passage in debates. So we see the Thanksgiving hymns here. So, moreover, I will not able to validate all that I say here. Those who read the previous entry where I discussed the Thanksgiving hymns, notice that Paul's introductory words here, blessed to be God the Father, are really a translation of the Hebrew used in the induction of the hymns. In fact, apart from the uniquely Christian elements in this text, this entire passage would be right at home amongst the Thanksgiving hymns that were discussed among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and this includes some of their most distinctive theological ideas. I believe detailed study of many of the parallels between Ephesians and Dead Sea Scrolls provides the clearest evidence that, here it is, that suggests that Paul had significant theological interaction with the Essenes who believed what is reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So that comes from blessed be the God and Father and thanking God. And he mentions that calling, effectual calling. And I believe that is what Robert Weisner is mentioning here with the parallel to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because we don't really see that much at all with direct. Well, we see that with Peter as well, many times. So, for my purpose here, I want to pay careful attention to Paul's language, verse 4 and 5. He describes election, God's election having taken place before the foundation of the world. For it is God's people, us. So this is, I'm sure you guys want to read it. I'll paste this in the comment section, and you guys can have a read of it. There it is. I'm sure you guys find that interesting for those who want to find it interesting. There's a lot of here. So the certain result of being elected and predestined is redemption through his blood, the forgiveness of our trespasses, verse 7, and participation in ultimate glory, verse 14. As mentioned above, Paul's language, here it is again, is strikingly similar to what we read in Thanksgiving hymns. And it says, you have determined before ever you created him. You alone have created the righteous one. From the womb you established him to give heed to your covenant at the appointment of time of grace for an eternal salvation and everlasting peace without want. In the wisdom of your knowledge, you determined their destiny before they came into existence. According to your will, everything comes to pass and nothing happens apart from you. I'd like to mention something that sounds very similar that I missed it. I missed what I wanted to mention, because that sounded similar to what Paul mentions in Galatians 1. My computer's laggy. I apologize. Oh, man. Oh, it's gone berserk now. Galatians 1, verse 15, and it mentions grace and calling. But then you set me apart before I was born, who called me by his grace. And that sounds familiar, something what I read there before. You alone have created the righteous from the womb. You established him to give count appointed time of grace. That sounds similar to what Paul mentioned there. Grace and from the womb. He mentions from the womb and grace. And he mentions pretty much before he was born and grace. So that sounds very similar, I reckon, for those who are interested maybe. Anyway, Paul tells us that on what basis God does it with his credit to him here. He tells us repeatedly that it was simply God's desire to do according to the purpose of his will, according to his purpose again. We saw in the Sirach 33:13, likewise, the treatise to Spirit, we see that God ordains all things according to his glorious plan. So we see very similar wording here in language, according to the purpose of his will. Ephesians 1, verse 5, according to his purpose, verse 9. Very similar here we see we see in the two spirits, we see that God ordains all things through his glorious plan. Thanksgiving hymns on God's sovereign election for ordination according to his good pleasure, which is translated in Greek, Old Testament, the same language Paul uses here, okay? So we see parallel here. So let's say Paul didn't get influenced by the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Essenes. Why is there similar wording and language and terms used here? I find if I was from the other side, the synergistic view, I personally would have a very hard time explaining this away. Reading context, it seems difficult to deny that Paul described election in terms of individual predestination to salvation, as did the Essene community who authored the Dead Sea Scrolls. So we see here, and we'll probably go on an hour now. Yep, 1 hour, so we've gone over the time, but we'll almost... Well, I want to discuss 4 topics, especially highlight predestination elements in Paul's argument, which he shares in common with the Jewish sources, espouse predestination election, Paul's calling language, meaning of foreknowledge, and background potter clay imagery. So Paul's calling language, which is pretty much effectual calling, everyone knows as the golden chain in salvation. So I'm going to find the we know that Paul mentions calling a lot in his letters. So God's call is always effective for Paul, and therefore he's happy to simply refer to Christians, those who are called, since those who are not in faith. So I want to ask a question for anyone who are synergists who are listening. Why is it in the epistles of Paul and Peter and John that it always seems that God calls, God chooses, God elects? It's always of God, 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 but very little, if ever, we see the act of human will. It's because you acted, you are saved, in a sense. If it's synergistic, we probably should see God mentioned and man, but most of the time we see God called me before I was born. God predestined me before time began. All of these things, but we don't see emphasis of human will in Paul, in a sense. But which is interesting. But this is why I believe we see many times God calls us and transforms us from the kingdom of darkness to light. God does the transforming. Let's see a parallel here. Okay, we see a parallel here, Thanksgiving hymns. So the remnants of effectiveness and creative power of God's word, we saw that discussing Sirach on the previous post, Sirach 16:28. We are told that nothing in creation disobeys God's word. And 42:15 we read that God creates by his word, and this results in obedience of his creatures. It is no surprise that in Thanksgiving hymns, we find the author praising God for having called him, resulting in his receiving mercy and forgiveness. The Old Testament background to this notion can be found in 43:1 and 7, where God's creation, forming, and calling of Israel are presented in synonymous parallel. God's call is no simple invitation. It is his powerful word that creates his his covenant people. I'm reading so fast. Drink a lot of water. That one called may or may not obey. God's calling in his life-giving creative decree, which infallibly elects, tends, and justifies. Okay. So meaning of foreknowledge and also mean predestination, because it depends on the topic, the context actually. This is a long article on this one, as you can see on the side here. Just past halfway, we see, okay, here, at the end of the treatise, the two spirits, God's foreknowledge is the same. He's deciding the fate of humanity. In the Thanksgiving hymns, we read, "For apart from you, nothing is done, and nothing without your will is known." Okay, here God's knowledge and logically follows from His works as Creator. The future is a reflection of God's prior knowledge. God does not learn when He peers down the corridors of time, since the future takes shape and does not prior creative activity. This view espoused by Paul is another parallel. This view espoused by Paul is clearly in line with the presented in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is different from what we see in Jubilees, wherein God chose Abraham and his sons because He foresaw they would obey. We don't see that anywhere in the language of the Old Testament and New Testament. This later notion is completely foreign to Paul, and as we will see, flatly contradicts Paul's affirmations in Romans 9 and 11. So background to potter clay imagery. I'm sure everyone knows that one. We see that in Isaiah 29:16 and 45:9 in Old Testament. We find some important parallels to Paul's use of this metaphor in Dead Sea Scrolls, Sirach 33. And so we see this: "Who can your glory measure? Who indeed is man among your glorious works? As what can he be born of a woman, be reckoned before you, kneaded from the dust? His body but a bread of worms, he's so much spit, mere nipped off clay, and for clay his longing shall clay contest and vessel plumb counsel." Additionally, Thanksgiving hymns are several references to God forming His people destinies, using same Hebrew verb found in Isaiah 29:16 and 45:9, which evokes the same pot of clay imagery we find in Paul. Perhaps the clearest parallel to Paul's argument among Thanksgiving hymns can be seen here. And what shall the dust answer, and what shall it understand? And how shall it stand its ground before who rebukes it? For you are righteous, and there is none compare with you. So what then is the one who returns to its dust? As you can see, there's Sirach's mentioned a lot. And so another mention of Thanksgiving hymns, including this power, wrath, and mercy. This is precisely the conclusion author of the Thanksgiving hymns withdraws from perhaps the most overtly predestination passage in our source, and this is what it says: "You have prepared them in order to execute great judgments among them before your creatures, that they might be a sign eternal, so that you all might know your glory and great power." So Israel's hardening and future reversal. As you can see, there's a lot to read here, and I've just gone a little bit, and I've gone over an hour, so I'm trying to get through this. Gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. Romans 9:29. Okay, so conclusion to the series. I've been talking for so much for an hour, and I'm a little bit out of breath. Feels like I've been going for a marathon. But anyway, okay, I've gone for over an hour. Hopefully, guys, you've seen a little bit, and this is very little compared to what I've said. In light, there's many books that you can get into and read and buy. This is just touching very little of what has been written, and like I said, you can find the Dead Sea Scrolls book. Actually, I can look it up now. Dead Sea Scrolls book, and you can see it here. My computer's a little laggy. Here it is. This is the one that I found. the complete Dead Sea Scrolls for those who are very interested in this subject or topic. Actually, probably at the end of this. My computer's laggy. Yeah, I got to delete that. Okay, so hopefully you guys can read this. Okay, had too much in my tab, so I deleted or removed. So here it is, complete Dead Sea Scrolls in English. And this is something that you can look into and buy if you want. And so talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, if I type in election, does it come up? No, but I'm sure they would be there. So there it is. If you want to buy it, the whole complete Dead Sea Scrolls, and how much pages is it? Anyway, from what I remember, there was a lot of pages. Where does it say the pages? Here. No, it doesn't say anything here. 698 pages. There it is. Okay, so that's a huge book. For those who are interested, I encourage you to buy it. If you want to study it further, and there's many other books, like I said, type in Paul, Predestination, Election, Judaism, and Second Temple, and you'll find some very interesting things that Paul most likely was influenced by, because the languages are very similar and things like that. All right, guys, I guess that's it. I've been talking for so long that I need a break. All right, guys, thanks for listening. God bless, and have a good day and night. See you guys. Thanks for listening.